Hello everyone. I am Pratiksha, and today I am going to take your class on Indian economy. And the topic that I have chosen is India's economic reforms. Now, these reforms were introduced in India in 1991. And why I have chosen this topic is because I believe that to get a very comprehensive understanding of India's economy, it is very important that we read, we understand. The major decisions and the reforms which were introduced by the government of India from time to time. And when we do so, when we get a good analytical reasoning as to why these reforms, decisions, were something which were adopted, which were taken by the government from time to time, we are able to make more sense of the crisis and the policy measures which are adopted today, right? So to before begin with, making you understand the economic reforms, I'll introduce you to myself. I am Pratiksha. I'm currently pursuing my graduation in economics and political science from Shivaji College. I'm a final year student, and as per my hobbies are concerned, I love public speaking. I've been part of speech and debate competitions. I love reading books as well as I love teaching. That's about me. Now, we'll first try and understand about, we'll get overview as to what we will study, because it is very important that to understand India's economic reforms of 1991, we understand why and what was it that led to these reforms of 1991, why we had these reforms. So that is very important. When we do so, when we understand what were those things which led us to here, we get more clearer and better picture of the reforms of 1991, right? So as for the overview, we often consider 1991 to be one of the benchmark year in the economic history of India, not just because of the reforms of 1991, but because the gravity that the reforms of 1991 hold for India, right? Held for India at that time. What happened? What was it that led to the reforms of 1991? So there is a background story behind it. 1991 is often described to be one of the most, one of those years where India's economy was literally in a state of turmoil, was in a state where we didn't even had the forex cover, which could, last us for our imports, which could act as an import cover for, even a fortnight. So that was even more difficult to do so. Our fiscal deficit was mounting, exports were slumped. So it was very difficult for us to, make a better understanding and to manage the situation at that time. So it was a state of crisis in the mid of 1991. So the response of the government was that okay, fine, it is not something that we have to deal with the problem that it has come, but also to understand that the path which has led us to this crisis, to understand that pathway which has led us to the crisis and to try and reform that pathway that we adopted, which led us to the crisis, right? And that is why we were concerned with not only correcting the weaknesses at the fiscal and the BOP fronts, as well as removing the rigidities which had developed in the system. And that is why it has been rightly described as the crisis of 1991 as an opportunity converted by India. In the next slide, I have, got a bar graph which depicts that how the foreign exchange reserves in 1991 were at the lowest levels, as we can observe over here. It is less than less than $50 billion. It's around $1.2 billion, and as I just mentioned, not enough to cover us. Not enough to act as an import cover for fortnight, right? Then the external debts. That is not a problem that a country has external debt, but external debt where we are, using the external debt to finance our expenditure, and not able to repay back, and not just the principal amount, but also a surplus of interest payment, right? That is where the problem kicks in, and that is what had happened with India at that front. This is a newspaper clip from Indian Express, which shows that how in the mid of 1991, rupee was depreciating drastically when compared to the US dollar. Now we'll try and understand that why, this whole crisis happened. What was the reason that this crisis erupted in 1991? Is it something that happened all of a sudden? क्या एकदम से हो गया? नहीं, it wasn't like that. Nothing happens overnight in any of the drastic problems that we face today. It always has its threads attached to it, to some or the other things, right? And that is what led to the problem of the crisis of 1991, right? So there is again a story behind it. We, after getting independence, we were very skeptical as to what economic model we should pursue, whether we should go to the capitalist economic model, whether we should adopt the socialist model. So we were confused about it, right? Pandit Nehru came up, the then Prime Minister of India came up with an idea that we should adopt mixed economic model, right? And this economic model was the one where state was going to be the leader in the economic growth of India. Now, initially, the policies, the programs that the government had adopted, they were not only good, but also yielded result because they were important. We were a colony of Britishers, and it was equally important that we give due space to our domestic producers. But that is when the problem came, when things became difficult, right? The private sector was not allowed to operate in a lot of activities. There were excessive control on the private sector by way of licenses, permits. India adopted an inward-looking trade policy where we focused on how we should protect our domestic producers. We should not import a lot of things because in a fear that those imported goods would come up, would create the competition, our domestic producers would be crushed. And that is why slowly, this again, I mentioned that initially after gaining independence, this was not a problem. Instead, this was something which was helping us. But years by years, when we thought that we should open up, right, our economy, that didn't happen. And that is why slowly those rigidities got aggravated and converted into the crisis of 1991. There was another act which was there, an MRTP Act. Now, this act, again, has a story behind it. We came up with this act so that to, abolish, so as not abolish, but in a way to restrict monopolies, right? But again, to even in that process of restricting monopolies, we were not very successful, right? Successful in a way that it didn't yield any economic result, right? A lot of business organizations were involved in lobbying the ministries, and the MRTP Act in itself was a failure because there was excessive, stringent government control and regulations over it. So it didn't allow a lot of private organizations to grow and flourish in a way that they required to do. And finally, the crisis was precipitated by the Gulf War, which was going on between Iran and Iraq at that time. India's swelled up import bill, the exports had slumped, and the credits had dried up. And a lot of people, since they were skeptical about India's growth, they were not very confident about India's market. So they decided to take their money out of India, right? So all of those things have been mentioned here. Now, break with the past. Now, this is the reform. Now, that is the reason why we came up. Like, okay, fine. We don't have to tackle this problem which had erupted in 1991, but the roots which have led us to this problem. And that is why we decided to do the break with the past. We dismantled, we had the policy of liberalization, privatization, globalization. Liberalization, opening up, right? Opening up ourselves. We cannot restrict ourselves to just what we are, making in India, consuming in India. We cannot make us an economy that way. We can't grow that way. So we dismantled the license and permit system. We abolished, we relinquished our, trade policy, which had made us look inward, and rather adopted a policy which would connect us to the outdoor world, right? So that is where India opened up. It removed tariffs, it removed quotas, it liberalized its economy, right? So as to make it in a way inclusive, right? And not just restricted to some of the selected organizations, some of the selected state organizations. Then privatization. A lot of public sector undertakings were not performing well. They were incurring losses. The government, of course, since the government had its money invested into it, it cannot shut them out easily. So the government strategically decided to disinvest those units. Then we had decided to de-reserve some of the goods that the MSMEs produce. Now, the medium, small, and micro enterprises, to protect them, the government came up with the idea that, only there are certain goods which should be reserved for MSMEs. This created a lot of problems. MSMEs were not able to produce efficient goods, right? So we decided that we are going to de-reserve those goods, right? MSMEs, others, everyone can produce what MSME can produce. You shouldn't reserve those goods exclusively for MSMEs, right? And finally, opening up, right? Connecting to the world economy, integrating ourselves to the world economy. That is what globalization is all about, right? So over here, the first 2 points talk about how we opened up, we liberalized our economy, opening areas, all of this talks about privatization. And finally, all liberalization, privatization collectively led us to the globalization. Now here is this again, a chart which shows that what has changed since 1991. So during 1991, we can see that the rupee value when compared to dollar was just 21.14, which is, it was falling drastically, right? And this is, one of the situation can itself, reflect the gravity of the situation of 1991. And today, this data is of 2016, but currently rupee holds its value around 70, 75, 76, which in itself has consolidated itself, stabilized itself in front of the most stable currency, that is the US dollar. Again, as I mentioned, that how forex reserves were important. During 1991, we just had an import cover of $1.12 billion. And today we are able to create a forex reserve, which is, build up the confidence of the market. The current account deficit, again, we are able to reduce not drastically, but to a level which is desirable, from 2.96% to 1.06%. The central's fiscal deficit. Now, the fiscal deficit has been an issue from time to time. It's not resolved till now, but the government has been able to reduce this ratio of fiscal deficit to GDP from 7.61% to 3.92%. And finally, the outstanding liabilities, which have again been reduced drastically from 8%, right, by 8%. So this just shows the situations prior to 1991 and how things stand today as of the last 4 to 5 years, right? Gives a pleasing picture about our economy. The road ahead. Now, it is important that we understand that, these were some of the major reforms that the government came up. These were important not just to, help our economy in a way that we want to come out of the crisis, but to remove those rigidities. And today, we can look at those reforms. We can understand from those reforms, because today we again are in a state of crisis, an economic crisis which is created by COVID-19 pandemic, created situation where the manufacturing sector has been showing a sluggish growth since the past 1 year. Unemployment, which has increased drastically. Since the introduction of GST, the states are not able to get a fair share. The collection shortfalls haven't been compensated by the center from time to time to the states, and the aid that the industry wants. So again, it is not as if, if 1991 was a benchmark year, then again, this year where COVID-19 has kicked in, those times will be the benchmark year for future. And to tackle those times where our economy stands today, we had came up with a plan that the government had introduced about the tranche of Atmanirbhar Bharat. And with this lecture, I just wanted to draw the attention as to how we can learn from the reforms, we can learn from the crisis, and can convert into an opportunity, right? So creating an economic model, COVID-19 has taught us that we want an economic model which is resilient, which is able to absorb shocks. We cannot just have crisis and just immediately, have solutions to mitigate those crises. We need to have resilient economy. We should be able to absorb the shocks which are coming from time to time. That is what the 21st century demands from us, right? And I've just mentioned all of this in this slide. Finally, this is all about the reforms of 1990, and I hope that you are able to get a good understanding, a broad understanding of this topic. You can refer to it from any of your book and can get more clarity upon it, right? If you have any doubt about whatsoever in this lecture of mine, you can email me and can let me know. So that is about it. Thank you so much.